And now it's time for the analysis of Shields and Brooks. That's syndicated columnist Mark Shields and New York Times columnist David Brooks. First off, your reactions to the interview so far?
What I find interesting is I don't pay any attention to books from politicians. And the only time to listen to any politician waxing semi-candid is when they're either over 70 or giving up all hopes of the White House. And I think Mrs. Clinton is not 70 or close to it, I guess, but she's obviously given up all hopes of the White House. And in that sense, there's a lot more candor than I think than I've certainly seen in past books. An admission that every candidate is ultimately responsible for his or her campaign, victory or defeat, and every campaign is inevitably a mirror reflection of the candidate. And she does accept responsibility, but she doesn't do it exclusively. She wants to share it with some in the press, with other forces in our society.
Well, as for the book, it's tough to be reflective and a good storyteller and be in the public sphere. You're so active that you don't have time for reflection. And I read the book and I thought it was interesting. By political standards, way more interesting. I think she's right, as she said in the interview, that it was just not her year. She's not going to be the anger outsider politician. I think she puts too much emphasis on Comey and all that other stuff and the Russians in blaming this. But she has cusps of thought throughout the book. For example, at one point she says she really loves the parable of the prodigal son. And she says, I'm so much like the older brother who's the rule follower. And of course, then you think, well, Bill Clinton is the ultimate younger brother, the prodigal son. Yeah. And she's on the cusp of a really interesting insight about her relationship with him. But she never takes the next step. And I think that's just because active people, I remember I once interviewed Margaret Thatcher, and she was the same way. So much active, not a writer, not reflective, not getting you the analysis you actually want. But that's just a product of being in the public sphere. I think the book is far more interesting than most political books of that sort.
Yeah. Obama wrote a very good book, but he wasn't a presidential candidate at the time.
There was a section in there about foreign policy where she kind of slips back into Secretary of State mode. She's almost, you could see that she's excited to weigh in on this. And she also takes Secretary Tillerson to task. Well, he's never called me. I don't necessarily know what their foreign policy is.
No, I mean, that was. I mean, it was really a memorable passage in her interview with Judy. What's interesting is Donald Trump, Rex Tillerson, of course, serves at the pleasure or displeasure of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, unlike anybody else in American history after winning the presidency, made no attempt to reach out. In fact, he's continued to berate her and beat her up at his rallies and continue to have rallies and run against her. So it almost made her toxic to his administration. But I'm surprised that Tillerson, once he got the job, didn't call her and have a sit down. You know, I just think it's part of it. But if you think about it, Donald Trump, once he won, never reached across. I mean, he never met with Jimmy Carter. He never talked to George H.W. Bush. I mean, there was none of. So I guess Tillerson doesn't surprise me, but you know, it's no question she's totally disappointed and disenchanted with his stewardship at state, and very frank about the National Security Council and the disarray, the Michael Flynn period, and that McMaster spent the last 7 months trying to get rid of the people that Flynn brought in, and had to wait for General Kelly to get there to complete the broom.
Yeah, well, she is an institutionalist, and when she was in the Senate, she respected the rules and the standards of the Senate. When she was Secretary of State, she was very much of the building and of the body, and going around the world interviewing people. And I generally like institutionalists. I think organizations are really what change history, rarely a random person. But let's face it, this election was about anti-institutionalism. It was about, we don't like the way those things are working in Washington, let's burn the place down. And so it's not surprising the Trump administration is bad at institutions, and they're hollowing out all our institutions. They were sort of hired to do that. I happen to think that was a mistake, a bad way to run government, but that sort of is what they're hired to do.
There was also a section on race where she weighed in on the divisiveness that she says Trump exacerbates.
Yeah, I there's a mixture here. Trump clearly plays identity politics and white identity politics. And race has been a strong factor in this election. There's no question about that. I think it's always necessary to be careful and not say Trump won because of race. I think a lot of the people who voted for Trump voted for him on a million different reasons, a lot of them quite legitimate reasons. And so I think she sometimes in her interview with Judy gets a little close saying he's the KKK candidate. I think that's overly simplistic. Is there a white identity stream running through his thought, which is deeply disturbing? After Charlottesville, we saw that to be a case. But I don't think you want to play this election as, well, white racism won this election. I don't think that's fair.
I disagree to this extent. I thought she put it, she couched it. She said he gives rhetorical encouragement to white supremacists, and I don't think anybody can argue with that. And you know, his revised position number 9 on Charlottesville, that there's bad dudes on both sides. I mean, he just can't. I mean, didn't know who David Duke was. You know, there's no question that he is the great original sin of America, which has been so prominent in American politics and so central to our presidential experience of the past 60 years, that Donald Trump is an outlier and remains an outlier. I mean, he doesn't see the duty or the responsibility of a president to bring together the country racially, and I think she's legitimate at that, and certainly his language has been loose.
You know, there's a pivot we'll make in the conversation where she actually gives credit to Donald Trump on the sort of the DACA conversation, the immigration conversation that's now happening with Democrats. For what seems to be the second time in a month now, Trump has sided with Democrats, much to the chagrin of Republicans.
Yeah. So all my life, I've been waiting for a president who would go with the Democrats when the merits of the argument on their side and go with the Republicans when the merits are on their side. And now finally it turns out to be Donald Trump who's doing this. So, oh well. You know, so I guess I think two things. I think, one, this particular deal, if it is a deal, is a good deal. And I think most of the country, only 12% of the country, thinks that DACA people should be sent out of the country. It's a pretty popular position to want to, some way, codify their position in this country. And the wall is a stupid idea. I don't think Donald Trump actually believes that we should build a wall with Mexico. And so if that's the deal, that's a good deal on the merits. Can Donald Trump continue to be a bipartisan president? Well, I wish we had a skilled political operator who could do that. I don't think Donald Trump is that skilled political operator. It takes great skill to go with one party and then go with another. And I fear what he's going to end up doing is isolating himself, the distrust of both parties, isolating himself from his administration, which is pretty down-the-line conservative, and discrediting bipartisanship along the way. So if we were going to have an independent president, which is something I think we need, I wish it was somebody a little more politically skilled.
Does the president deserve credit, Mark?
Yes, he does deserve credit. You know, when I talk about motives, but if in fact 700,000 Americans can come out from the shadows and not be at the whim or the cruel caprice of a brutal employer who wants to expose them, or some you know, personal enemy or some sheriff who's looking for headlines. Yes, I mean, that is good. That is good for America. I agree with David. The numbers, Americans are overwhelmingly in favor. I mean, you're talking about misanthropes in the single percentage numbers of people who really want to punish and send back kids who were brought here at the age of 3 and have grown up and are working here. But I think what I find most fascinating to me is the Cleveland Indians have been in a 22-game winning streak, and Donald Trump has been in an uninterrupted losing streak since January. And when you're in a losing streak, you change the lineup, you change the batting order. He changed teams. I mean, he just said, no, you know, this Republican team, I'm going to work with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. You know, it'll last about the extent of most his relationships have a very short shelf life, and political relationships anyway. And I think, but yes, if it does achieve that, we're a long way from getting there. And the Republican leadership and the Republican membership of the House and the Senate have their feelings hurt, have more than that. They've had their prestige undermined, their their power sabotaged by the president doing this.
Trump is going to go so far left, he's going to be filling in for Mark on his weeks off. We're going to go all the way over the other side.
The seat is open here anytime he wants. But speaking of continuing with that sort of sports analogy, I mean, what does this do to his diehard fans, the ones that show up in the middle of winter?
Yeah, I think the evidence so far is that it doesn't really hurt him. There's some of the diehard fans like Ann Coulter are upset. And there are a lot of people who are burning their MAGA hats, the Make America Great Again hats, because they're upset. But if you look at the Sean Hannitys and those people, and a lot of the people are calling into the Rush Limbaugh show, they want to drain the swamp, and they don't like Mitch McConnell very much. And if he goes against Mitch McConnell and he changes things up in Washington, so far the evidence is they're willing to stick with Trump and not really walk away from him.
Mark?
Yeah, no, I mean, among the Republican voters who supported him in the primaries in 2016, 3 out of 5 of them thought that immigration has weakened the country. But among Republicans at large, those who didn't support him, 3 out of 5 believe that immigration has strengthened the country, and overwhelmingly that is the case. And I do think that he has great political insights. And he said, when I stood at Fifth Avenue and shot somebody at high noon, people wouldn't believe me. And he does. He has a very loyal constituency, and I don't think it hinges on this issue by any means. He's going to have to come away with something, and what could kill this in the House is the Republicans in the House have never passed immigration reform at any time because they could not get a majority of the majority. So they're going to have to come up with something that's tough, whether it's a wall or, bamboo shoots under the fingernails of people who, come in illegally or something, and which may be a deal killer for the Democrats. I mean, so that has been the case in the past, and I fear that we're a long way from this being signed into law.
All right, Mark Shields, David Brooks, thank you both.
Thank you.